Standing under the crystal chandeliers, my son told 300 people that he was a failure because of me. He pointed a trembling finger at the back table, claiming my fear had clipped his wings for 35 years. The room turned to stare, seeing only a silent, old woman in a faded dress. They did not know that while he was building a monument to his excuses, I had secretly built an empire he could never touch. My name is Margaret Doyle, and at 63 years old, I have learned that the darkest shadows often exist under the brightest lights. I sat at table 42, tucked near the kitchen service doors of the Grand Harbourview Hotel ballroom, trying to make myself as small as possible. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of roasted lamb and expensive perfume. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress over my knees. It was 10 years old, purchased from a discount rack, but I had pressed it carefully that morning until the creases were sharp. Around me, the wealthy elite of Harbourview, Colorado, clinked crystal glasses, unaware that the woman sitting in the back was the punchline to the speech about to begin. Up on the stage, the lights were blindingly white, focused entirely on my son. Ethan stood at the podium, looking every bit the master of the universe at 35. He was being introduced as the rising star of Fairline Ridge Capital, the man with the golden touch. He smiled that charming, practiced smile that used to melt my heart when he was a toddler. Now, it just looked like a predator baring its teeth. He adjusted his silk tie and leaned into the microphone. He started talking about market volatility and fiscal discipline. But then, the tone shifted. He lowered his voice to a hush, the room falling silent to catch his words. He said he wanted to share his personal journey, the origin story that made him so hungry for success. I stiffened in my chair. I knew that tone. "I did not come from money," Ethan said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "I grew up in a suffocating environment of fear. My mother was a single woman with no direction, no ambition, and absolutely no spine." I felt the blood drain from my face. He was doing it again. He was using me as a prop. He continued, pacing the stage. "We lived in a roach-infested apartment because she was too afraid to ask for a raise. She had no college degree. She taught me that the world was a terrifying place and that risks were to be avoided at all costs. I had to claw my way out of that mediocrity." He paused for dramatic effect, looking straight into the camera lens. "If I fail, it is because I have not yet fully escaped the shadow of cowardice that my mother cast over me." Suddenly, the room shifted. A camera operator near the front swung his lens toward the back of the room. My face, magnified and terrified, appeared on the massive screen behind Ethan. I saw myself up there. I looked old. I looked grey. 300 heads turned to look at table 42. Their eyes were not kind. They looked at me with a mixture of shock, curiosity, and deep pity. I was no longer a person to them. I was a cautionary tale, a specimen of failure in a jar. I glanced toward the front table. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, was clapping softly, a tight smile plastered on her face. She leaned toward the woman next to her. I could read her lips perfectly. She whispered, "He is so brave to finally speak the truth about his toxic family." I gripped the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. I kept my back straight, refusing to slump, though every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. Inside, a scream was building. Every overtime shift I had worked, every skipped meal so he could have new shoes, every second-hand textbook I had bought him, it was all being twisted. He was taking my sacrifice and turning it into an accusation. He was selling my humiliation to buy their trust. Ethan was finishing up now. He wiped a theatrical tear from his eye. If I stumble, ladies and gentlemen, it is because I am still doing the hard work of correcting the mistakes my mother made. But I am a fighter. The room erupted. They stood up. They cheered for his resilience. They cheered for his victory over me. To them, it was an inspiring story of a man pulling himself out of the mud. They did not care that I was the mud. The applause died down, and the MC stepped to the microphone, beaming. Let's have the mother stand up. Let's give a round of applause for the woman who raised such a warrior, even if she did not know how to fight herself. The spotlight hit me. It burned my skin. I pushed my chair back and stood up slowly. My legs felt heavy, like lead. I forced a tight, wobbly smile onto my face. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, threatening to spill over. But I clenched my jaw. I would not give him that satisfaction. He had blamed me for everything one too many times. As I stood there, bathed in the pitying applause of strangers, I realized something cold and hard was settling in my chest. This was the last time he would ever use me like this. 6 years ago. The calendar on the wall of the break room said it was my 57th birthday. It was also my last week at Everbright Claim Services, a place where I had spent 30 years of my life answering phones and listening to strangers complain about their deductibles. The air in the room smelled of stale coffee and the industrial cleaner the janitors used on the linoleum floors. My retirement party, if you could call it that, was a 20-minute affair squeezed between the lunch shift and the 2 o'clock meeting. On the folding table sat a rectangular sheet cake from the grocery store down the street, in bright blue icing. It read, "Happy Birthday, Margit." They had forgotten the second A and the ERR, shortening my name just as the company had shortened my horizons for 3 decades. I looked at the typo and felt a familiar, dull ache in my chest, but I forced a laugh. Well, looks like they charged by the letter, I said, trying to make it easy for them. Sheila, the office manager who was 10 years younger than me, handed me a paper plate with a thin slice of vanilla sponge. "We are going to miss you." "Margaret?" she said, her eyes already drifting to the clock on the wall. "But honestly, I am jealous. You finally get to just rest. No more alarms. Right. You are basically done with the hard part of life." Done. The word hung in the air like dust. They were not talking about a vacation. They were talking about me as if I were an old appliance being unplugged and carried down to the basement. I was being archived. I checked my phone under the table. I had been checking it every 10 minutes for the last 2 hours. There was a single new message from Ethan. I opened it, hoping for a promise of dinner or just a voice on the other end of the line. Can't make it. Client meeting ran late. Happy B-Day. No, love, Ethan. No, I'll call you later. Just a transactional update. I stared at the screen until the backlight dimmed. I told myself it was fine. He was 35% busier than anyone else I knew. He was building an empire. He did not have time for sheet cake and old women. I drove home to Maple Court, the apartment complex where the beige carpet always smelled faintly of damp wool, and the neighbours argued too loudly through the thin walls. I unlocked the door to Unit 4B and stepped into the silence. It was heavy, this silence. It pressed against my ears. I put my keys in the bowl and looked around the kitchen. The cabinets were peeling slightly at the corners. The table was a second-hand piece I had bought when Ethan was in high school. I sat down in the dark, not bothering to turn on the overhead light yet. I thought about the bills I had paid. Thousands of electric bills, rent checks, insurance premiums. I had kept the lights on. I had kept the water running. But looking at the empty chair across from me, I asked myself a question that made my stomach turn. What did I actually build? The voice of my ex-husband. Ray, drifted up from the depths of my memory. He had been gone since Ethan was 8 years old, but his cruelty had a long shelf life. I could hear him standing in the doorway of our old house, laughing as I looked at a brochure for night classes. "Margaret, be real," he had said, his voice dripping with that casual disdain. "A woman like you, dreaming of college is just sort of ridiculous. You are a worker bee, honey. You are not the queen." I shook my head to clear the sound, but another memory replaced it. This one was sharper because it was Ethan. He was 16, frustrated with his homework. He had looked up at me, his eyes full of teenage confusion that bordered on accusation. "Mom, why didn't you go to college like the other mums? It is like you didn't even try to be anything." He had not meant to be cruel. Or maybe he had. It felt like a knife peeling away a layer of my skin. I stood up and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room. There sat the laptop I had bought on an installment plan 3 months ago. I had told myself I would use it to learn something new, maybe digital marketing or creative writing. I opened it now. The screen glowed blue, illuminating the wrinkles on my hands. I opened a blank document. The cursor blinked at me. It blinked and blinked. A rhythmic taunt. Type something. I commanded myself. My fingers hovered over the keys. I felt ridiculous. I felt like a child playing dress-up in a scholar's robes. But the silence in the apartment was too loud. So I started to type. I am 57 years old today. I have $20 in my wallet. My son is ashamed of me. And I feel like I have been holding my breath for 40 years. I stopped. The words looked pathetic on the white screen, but they were true. I sat there in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the world, and watched the cursor blink. I wondered if the game was already over, if the clock had run out, or if there was still enough time on the board to make a move that actually mattered. The years following his graduation from Western Ridge University were a blur of slammed doors and angry phone calls. Ethan did not just stumble into adulthood, he crashed into it. And every time he hit a wall, he looked for someone to blame for the bruising. He was in his mid-20s, a time when he should have been finding his footing. But instead, he was cycling through failures like a man flipping through bad TV channels. First, there was the artisanal coffee shop idea that burned through his savings in 4 months. Then came the ride-sharing app that got him sued for copyright infringement. Then, a short-lived career as an online financial consultant, which was ironic considering he could barely manage his own checkbook. Every time a venture collapsed, he retreated to my apartment. He would storm in, throwing his coat on the floor, his face twisted in a permanent scowl of injustice. One evening, after the consulting business finally imploded, he paced around my small kitchen, kicking the legs of the table I had owned since he was a baby. The sound of wood hitting wood made me flinch. "It is not fair," he spat out, turning to look at me with eyes that were cold and hard. If I had a mother who was actually somebody, if you had a decent degree, or connections, or even just a little bit of class, I would not have to go around begging for investment like a beggar. I froze, the dish towel in my hands suddenly feeling heavy. "Ethan," I worked double shifts to pay for your tuition. I did everything You did the bare minimum, he shouted, his voice cracking. Look at Jason's mum. She made one phone call and he got seed money. You can't even get me a discount on car insurance. I am out there fighting with one hand tied behind my back because I came from this. He gestured around my kitchen, at the clean but worn countertops, at the life I had scraped together for us. I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if he had physically struck me. I wanted to scream that I had sacrificed my own dreams so he could have his. I wanted to tell him that keeping a roof over our heads without a husband and without a degree was not a sign of weakness, but a feat of strength. But the words died in my throat. In his narrative, I was not a survivor. I was the anchor that had dragged him down. The accusation did not stop at private arguments. It evolved. Ethan discovered the internet's appetite for trauma, and he decided to feed it. He started a podcast called Surviving a Toxic Family. He recorded it in his bedroom, speaking into a microphone I had bought him for his birthday. He never used my name, but he described our life with surgical precision. He talked about the peeling wallpaper in the hallway. He described the generic brand cereal I bought. He painted a portrait of a childhood that was not just modest, but maliciously restrictive. The podcast went viral. Suddenly, thousands of strangers were listening to my son rewrite history. They left comments calling him brave and a warrior. They praised his honesty. He began to believe his own fiction, drunk on the validation of people who had never met me. I remember the afternoon I listened to episode 5. I was sitting in the living room, the late afternoon sun highlighting the dust motes in the air. Ethan's voice came through my phone speaker, smooth and confident, a voice I barely recognized. My mother looked me in the eye. He told his audience, pausing for dramatic effect. And she told me that poor people like us should know their place, that dreaming was dangerous. I gasped, dropping the phone onto the sofa cushions. No. I whispered to the empty room. That is not true. I remembered the conversation he was twisting. He had wanted to take out a $50,000 loan with a predatory interest rate to fund a risky crypto scheme. I had grabbed his hands, terrified for him, and said, Ethan, please go slow. Do not borrow more than you can handle, or the debt will hurt you. He had taken my maternal protection and repainted it as oppression. He had turned my caution into a cage. The next day, I saw my neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, at the mailboxes. She usually stopped to chat about the weather, but this time, she looked at me quickly and then looked away. Her eyes held a mixture of pity and suspicion. She had heard it. She looked at me and saw the monster my son had described. The woman who crushed a child's spirit because she was too afraid to fly herself. A week later, Ethan called me. It was midnight. I am exhausted. Mum, he said, his voice thick with a performance of fatigue. I spend my whole life trying to heal the wounds you left on me. Do you have any idea how hard it is to build a business when you are broken inside? I held the phone tight against my ear. For the first time, a dark clarity washed over me. I realized that Ethan did not want to succeed. Not really. Because if he succeeded, he would lose his excuse. He would lose the story that made him special. I had raised a man who treated his own pain like an asset to be traded on the open market. I am sorry you feel that way. Ethan, I said quietly. Yeah. Well, sorry doesn't fix the past, he replied, and hung up. I sat there in the silence of the kitchen, I picked up my phone and opened his podcast app. I pressed play. She is the reason I am afraid. I pressed pause. My hand was shaking uncontrollably. I pressed play again. She clipped my wings before I could even walk. I turned it off, tossing the phone onto the table. But the silence was worse. In the silence, his voice echoed in my head, louder than any broadcast. It was a loop I could not escape. I realized then, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that I had not raised a son who was broken by the world. I had raised a man who used his own mother as a shield against his own incompetence. He did not want to be healed. He wanted to be a victim because being a victim was the only job he had ever been good at. If he succeeded, he was a hero who overcame his toxic mother. If he failed, he was a martyr crushed by his toxic mother. He could never lose, and I could never win. I reached out and tapped the screen, playing the clip again. Then I paused it. Then I played it. My finger moved with a nervous, jerky rhythm. Play. Pause. Play. Pause. I was looking for a crack in his conviction, a hint of the boy who used to cling to my leg when it thundered. But there was nothing there but a polished, marketable resentment. I finally turned the phone off completely. The kitchen was quiet again, but the damage was done. The sentence hung in the air like smoke. My son failed because of me. It repeated over and over in the dark. A dark incantation that I was terrified I might actually start to believe. The breaking point did not come with a shout, but with a silence. It happened on a Tuesday evening, right in the middle of my kitchen. Ethan was pacing back and forth, his face flushed with that familiar mix of desperation and arrogance. He wanted me to take a second mortgage on the apartment, my only asset, the only roof over my head to fund a new venture involving cryptocurrency consulting. It is guaranteed money. Mom, he said, slamming his hand on the counter. Why are you so stubborn? If you just sign the papers, I can pay you back in 3 months. Are you trying to sabotage me? Are you jealous? I opened my mouth to say that I was not jealous, that I was simply terrified of being homeless at 60, but the room suddenly tilted. The refrigerator hummed loudly, then stretched into a long, high-pitched whine. The linoleum floor rushed up to meet my face. When I woke up, the air smelled of antiseptic and harsh soap. I was in the emergency room. A heart monitor beeped a steady, rhythmic accusation next to my head. A doctor told me my blood pressure had spiked to dangerous levels. He used words like chronic stress and exhaustion. But it was the nurse, a woman my age with grey curls escaping her scrub cap, who actually diagnosed me. She adjusted my IV drip and looked me dead in the eye. "Honey," she said softly, "you have been holding your breath for too long. You know what they say on airplanes. You need to put your own oxygen mask on first, or you are no good to anyone, not even to him." She gestured toward the hallway where Ethan was arguing loudly on his phone, probably complaining to someone that his mother's health scare was inconveniencing his schedule. That cliché about the oxygen mask hit me harder than any medicine. I had spent 30 years suffocating myself so he could breathe, and he still complained about the quality of the air. A week later, my friend Margarita, who had worked the night shift with me back at Everbright, drove me to a small brick church on the edge of town. "Just come inside, Margaret," she said, guiding me by the elbow. "You do not have to talk, just listen." It was a support group for parents of what they called enmeshed adult children. I sat in a metal folding chair, clutching a styrofoam cup of lukewarm tea, and listened. I heard a father talk about his 30-year-old daughter who blamed him for her divorce. I heard a mother talk about a son who claimed her poverty mindset ruined his artistic career. I sat there, stunned. For years, I thought Ethan was unique. I thought his anger was a special, complicated puzzle that only I had failed to solve. But as I looked around the circle, I realized he was not a genius of suffering. He was a cliché. He was just another variation of a grown man refusing to grow up, using the past as a weapon to extort the present. That night, I went home and did something terrifying. I opened my laptop and navigated to the website for North Harbor Community College. My hands shook as I typed in my credit card information. It was $99 for an online course titled Introduction to Psychology and Narrative Writing. I am almost 60, I whispered to the empty room. I am ridiculous. But I clicked Submit Payment anyway. The first assignment was to write a letter to someone who had hurt us. A letter we would never send. I sat at my kitchen table at 2 a.m, the same time I used to wake up to warm Ethan's milk bottles. I started writing to him. I did not apologize. For the first time, I did not write. I am sorry I could not give you more. Instead, I wrote about the nights I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, calculating how to stretch $5 into 3 days of food. I wrote about the fear that tasted like metal in my mouth every time the rent was due. I wrote about how hard I worked to make sure he never saw me cry, and how he had mistaken my stoicism for coldness. 2 days later, I received an email from the instructor, a young woman named Alana, Margaret. She wrote, "This is powerful. It is not just complaining. It is witnessing. You write with a sharp, honest eye. You have a voice that makes people stop and listen. Keep going. You have a voice." I read that sentence 5 times. Ethan had told me for years that I was nothing, a zero, a void. But this stranger saw a voice. I found a forum online, a quiet corner of the internet for parents dealing with estrangement and blame. I created an account. I stared at the username field for a long time. Finally, I typed a single letter M. I pasted a short story based on my hospital visit, changing the names, stripping away the identifying details, but keeping the raw, throbbing emotion of that moment on the floor. I hesitated. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. If I posted this, I was no longer just taking it. I was telling it. I was turning my pain into something that belonged to me, not him. Just breathe, I told myself. I moved the cursor to the post button. My finger hovered, trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer electric shock of doing something solely for myself. I clicked. The screen refreshed. My words were there, black on white, floating in the digital ether. I sat back in my chair and let out a long, shaky breath. The apartment was silent, but for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a blank page waiting for me to fill it. The red notification bubble on the corner of my screen turned into a number I could barely comprehend. Over 500 people had replied to my first post. I sat there with my morning coffee, scrolling through comment after comment. They came from Ohio, from London, from small towns in Texas. They all said the same thing in different ways. I thought I was the only one. It was intoxicating. For years, I had lived on an island of shame, convinced that Ethan's behavior was a unique reflection of my failure as a mother. Now, I saw I was part of a vast, silent archipelago. The forum administrators messaged me the next day. They asked if I would consider managing a weekly column called Letters to Blamed Parents. They offered no money, just a platform. But I accepted immediately. I chose to remain, a faceless voice in the digital void. It felt safer that way. I could be honest without fear of Ethan finding out. Then came the email from Naomi Green. She was a freelance editor for an online magazine focused on midlife mental health. "Dear M," she wrote, "your voice has a texture that is rare. It is not just sad. It is resilient. We would like to commission a series. We can pay you $50 per article." $50. It was not a fortune. It was barely a week of groceries. But when I read that number, I cried. Someone was willing to pay for my thoughts. Someone saw value in the wreckage I had been trying to hide. I started waking up early, not to worry, but to work. My inbox filled with stories from strangers. A retired teacher whose daughter refused to speak to him because he wouldn't buy her a house. A widow whose son charged her for spending time with her grandchildren. I answered every single one. I told them they were not crazy. I told them that love does not mean accepting abuse. In healing them. I felt my own spine stiffening, but my double life was precarious. Ethan called me on a Tuesday night at 2 a.m. The ringtone shattered the peace of my apartment. I knew that ring. It was the sound of a crisis. "It is all gone." "Mom," he said, his voice slurring slightly. "The deal with the angel investor. He walked away." "I am sorry to hear that. Ethan," I said, keeping my voice steady. I grabbed my notebook and a pen. "He walked away because I didn't have the liquidity to show good faith." Ethan snapped. The sadness was gone, replaced by the familiar aggression. "If you had just signed the equity loan like I asked, if you had just trusted me for once, I would be rich right now. This is on you." My hand trembled over the paper, but I forced myself to write down his exact words. "This is on you." "I need $3,000 by tomorrow," he demanded, "to fix this, to save face." My heart hammered against my ribs. The old Margaret would have panicked. The old Margaret would have called a payday loan center. But the new Margaret had 500 comments telling her she was worth more than this. "No," I said. The silence on the other end was deafening. "What did you say?" he whispered, dangerous and low. I said no. I repeated, my voice shaking but audible. "I cannot give you any more money, Ethan. I have nothing left to give." "You are selfish," he screamed. The volume made me pull the phone away from my ear. "You want me to fail. You are jealous because I am trying to be something more than a loser clerk like you." I did not apologize. I did not beg for his forgiveness. I just listened, feeling the heat of his words, and I wrote them down. "Good night, Ethan," I said, and I pressed the red button. I sat there in the dark kitchen, shaking from the adrenaline. But I did not cry. Instead, I looked at my notebook. I had a transcript of the manipulation. It was textbook gaslighting. The next morning, I turned those notes into an article. It was raw, clinical, and devastatingly real. Naomi emailed me back within an hour of receiving it. "Margaret," she said, finally using my real name in our private correspondence. "This is not just a column anymore. This is a book. We need to collect these. There is a whole generation of parents waiting for this guide." She promised to help me find a publisher. She talked about contracts and royalties. I listened, feeling like I was floating above my own body. That evening, I sat at my laptop. The cursor blinked on the blank white page, just like it had years ago when I wrote my first diary entry. But I was not writing into the void anymore. I was writing a map for others to follow. I placed my fingers on the keys and typed the title in bold letters, "When Your Child Calls You the Culprit." I stared at the words. They looked like a declaration of war, but deep down, I knew they were actually a declaration of independence. The email from Ashwood Press was not a fanfare, but it was the most beautiful thing I had ever read. They were a small, independent publisher specializing in psychology and self-help. The editor wrote that they could only offer a modest advance of $1,500 and a print run of 2,000 copies. But they promised a marketing campaign targeted directly at therapists and support groups. I signed the contract at my kitchen table, my hand trembling just enough to make my signature look like it belonged to a younger, more nervous woman. I expected the book to vanish into the void of the internet, but fate had a different plan. 3 weeks after the release, a famous therapist on YouTube with 2 million subscribers held up my book in her video titled "The Myth of the Perfect Parent." She called it "A Manual for Survival." By the next morning, when your child calls you, the culprit was out of stock. I began living a double life. By day, I was Margaret, the quiet woman in apartment 4B who paid her rent with money orders. By night, I was Doyle. I appeared on podcasts and Zoom webinars, always with my camera turned off or covered by a generic silhouette avatar. People tell me I am brave, I told a podcast host during a recording session, my voice distorted slightly by the microphone. But I am not brave. I am just tired of holding the secret alone. While I was climbing out of the shadows, Ethan was diving deeper into them. He had pivoted his podcast. He was no longer just sharing his trauma. He was selling the cure. He launched a premium online course called Breaking the Chains: How to Divorce Your Toxic Lineage. The price tag was $499. I watched one of his promotional videos using a fake account. Ethan stood in a rented studio that looked like a high-end loft, wearing a suit I knew he could not afford. My mother used to lock me in the dark. He lied, his eyes wet with practiced tears. She told me I was worthless until I believed it. But I broke free, and for a small investment, you can too. I stared at the screen, my stomach turning. He was not just exaggerating anymore. He was inventing monsters. He was selling a fictional version of me to pay for his lifestyle. But cracks were appearing in his meticulously crafted facade. On a consumer review site, complaints started trickling in. People who had bought his course were angry. They claimed the content was repetitive, the live coaching sessions were cancelled at the last minute, and the promised exclusive community was a ghost town. One comment caught my eye. A user named TruthSeeker88 wrote, "Wait a minute. I just read a book by Doyle about being falsely accused by a narcissist's son. The details in her book match the trauma Ethan describes almost perfectly. But from the other side, has anyone else noticed this? I was not the only one watching." Tessa, a young investigative journalist from Open Field Report, had been tracking the rise of victimhood influencers. She noticed the comment. She bought my book. She listened to Ethan's podcast. She lined up the dates, the specific anecdotes about the rented apartment in the suburbs, and the failed coffee shop venture. She realized that there were two narratives spinning around the same axis, and they were on a collision course. Naomi called me on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice was tight. "Margaret," she said, We have a situation. A reporter named Tessa knows who you are. She figured it out. She says she has enough to run a story about the parallels between your book and Ethan's course. But she wants to give you a chance to speak first. She knows, I asked, gripping the edge of the counter. She knows everything, Naomi confirmed. She wants to interview Doyle on the record with your real name. I hung up the phone and walked to the window. Outside, the world looked the same as it always did. Cars were driving by. A neighbor was walking a dog. But inside my apartment, the air felt thin. If I agreed to the interview, I would be declaring war. I would be stripping Ethan of his victimhood publicly. He would hate me with a violence I had only glimpsed before. People might say I was a vindictive mother trying to ruin her son to sell books. But then I thought about the $499 he was charging vulnerable people to teach them lies. I thought about the woman he claimed locked him in the dark. That woman did not exist. I existed. And I was done hiding in the dark to keep his spotlight bright. I picked up the phone and dialed Naomi back. "Tell her yes," I said. "Tell her I am ready to step into the light." I met Tessa at a small, dimly lit cafe on the edge of the historic district, a place where the espresso machine hissed loudly enough to cover a conversation. I kept my coat buttoned to my chin. When she placed a small digital recorder on the table between us, I instinctively pulled back. "No recording," I said, my voice tight. "I am just here to listen." Tessa nodded, respecting my fear, but she didn't put the device away. She just left it off. She opened a thick manila folder and slid a stack of papers across the scratched wooden table. "I want you to look at these. Margaret," she said gently. "These were sent to me by 3 different people who took Ethan's course. They felt scammed, so they sent me everything." I looked down. There were receipts for wire transfers. There were emails from Ethan promising guaranteed emotional liberation and financial abundance. But then Tessa flipped to the next page, and the air left my lungs. It was a loan application for a small business grant. At the bottom was a signature, "Margaret Doyle. I never signed this." I whispered. "Look closer," Tessa said. I squinted. It was my signature, but it was too perfect. It was identical to the way I signed my tax returns. "It is a digital copy," Tessa explained, her voice low and serious. "He scanned your signature from an old document and pasted it here. And here." She flipped another page. "And here." I stared at a bank statement for an account I didn't know existed. It was opened in my name, using my social security number. But the contact email was a variation of Ethan's old gaming handle. "He is using your credit profile to leverage loans for his business because his own credit is shot," Tessa said. "Margaret, this isn't just lying. This is identity theft. This is fraud." My hands started to shake. I remembered our afternoon 3 years ago. Ethan had rushed into the apartment, waving a stack of papers. "Mom, I just need you to sign this for my health insurance beneficiary form. It is urgent, or I will lose coverage." I had signed it without reading, grateful he was being responsible. I had handed him the weapon he was now using to rob me. I can't," I stammered. "He is my son. He is making you an accomplice," Tessa said. She reached out and finally pressed the record button on the device. "Margaret, if you don't speak, the law will assume you were part of the scam. You need legal counsel." 2 days later, I sat in the office of Marcus Reed. He was a man who looked like he was carved out of granite, with a suit that cost more than my car. He specialized in financial crimes. He did not offer me tea. He offered me the truth. Here is the reality. Mrs. Doyle, Marcus said, leaning forward. Ethan has moved over $40,000 through accounts linked to your name. When, not if. But when the regulators look at this, they will come for you. You will lose your pension. You could face fines. If I report him, I started, my voice cracking. If I report him, will he go to prison? That depends on a judge, Marcus said coldly. But right now, you are standing on the tracks and a train is coming. You can't stop the train. You can only decide if you want to be tied to the tracks when it hits. He slid a formal affidavit across the mahogany desk. It was a statement declaring that I had no knowledge of these accounts and that my signature had been forged. I need to think, I said. I took the papers home for 3 nights. I did not sleep. I paced my small apartment. I looked at baby pictures of Ethan. I looked at the boy who used to bring me dandelions. Am I a monster? I asked the darkness. What kind of mother sends the police after her own child? But the answer came on a Thursday night at the support group. A man named David, a carpenter with rough hands, stood up and wept. I covered for him, David said, his shoulders shaking. He used my name to scam his friends. I paid them back to keep him out of trouble. And because I did that, because I didn't stop him, he did it again. Now he is in federal prison for 10 years. I didn't save him. I just helped him dig the hole deeper. I felt a chill run down my spine. I realized that by protecting Ethan, I wasn't loving him. I was feeding the very thing that was destroying him. I was letting him believe that he could burn the world down, and I would always be there to sweep up the ash. I drove straight to Marcus Reed's office the next morning. I didn't wait for an appointment. I walked to the receptionist, asked for a pen, and laid the affidavit on the counter. My hand shook violently as the pen touched the paper. I felt a wave of nausea. But then I thought of the signature he had stolen from me. He had taken my name, the name I had kept clean through decades of hard work, and dragged it through the mud. I am done, I whispered. I pressed the pen down. The ink flowed black and permanent. I signed Margaret Doyle. It didn't look like the perfect, scanned copy he had used. It looked jagged and fierce. It looked like the signature of a woman who was finally taking her life back. I handed the papers to the receptionist. Please file these, I said. Immediately. The fallout did not arrive with sirens or handcuffs. It arrived with the polite, bureaucratic, persistent ringing of my telephone. For 3 days straight. I fielded calls from fraud departments, small business loan officers, and an aggressive compliance manager from a fintech startup I had never heard of. They all asked the same questions about contracts I had supposedly signed and funds I had supposedly authorized. Each time, I gave them the same answer, directed by Marcus Reed. I told them to speak to my lawyer. Then, inevitably, the call came from Ethan. It was late afternoon. I stared at his name on the caller ID for a long moment before answering. I did not feel the usual spike of adrenaline or fear. I just felt a heavy, resigned exhaustion. Mom! His voice was high and tight, vibrating with panic. What did you say to them? The bank just froze the operating account. They are talking about a criminal investigation. You are destroying my work. He did not ask if I was okay. He did not ask why I had done it. He just immediately framed my self-defense as an act of aggression against him. I did not say anything that was not true, Ethan, I said. my voice steady. I was standing in my kitchen, holding a cup of tea, and my hand was perfectly still. I told them I did not sign those papers. Because I didn't. You are splitting hairs, he screamed. I could hear him pacing, his breath coming in short, angry, jagged gasps. I was going to pay it back. You know I was. It is like you want me to fail. You are jealous that I am trying to build something big. I am not jealous, I said, cutting him off. I am just not your collateral anymore. If you built your business on my stolen signature, then it was never really standing up in the first place. That is for you to explain to the law, not to me. Mom, please, he whined, the anger shifting instantly to manipulation. You can call them back. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them you forgot you signed it. Please. I can't go to jail. I can't help you. Ethan, I said, and I realized it was the kindest thing I had ever said to him. Goodbye. I hung up. I did not cry. The guilt was there, a dull ache in my chest, but it was overshadowed by a strange, new sensation. It was the feeling of gravity returning to its proper place. I was no longer carrying his world on my shoulders. 2 weeks later, Ashwood Press contacted me. The sales of When Your Child Calls You the Culprit were climbing steadily. They wanted a second edition. They wanted a new chapter specifically about the legal and emotional process of refusing to accept financial abuse. Along with the book deal came an offer from Northlight Audio. They wanted to produce a podcast hosted by me, titled No Longer the Scapegoat. I started recording in a rented booth downtown. It became a sanctuary. I interviewed forensic accountants, family therapists, and other parents who had been sued or scammed by their own children. We built a community out of our shared, shattered trust. Then came the email from Horizon Lane Studios. They were a major production company. They wanted to turn the book into a documentary series. Naomi came over to discuss it. We sat in my new living room. I had moved out of the old apartment at Maple Court. I had used my first royalty check to put a down payment on a small, bright condo in a quiet complex called The Willows. I don't want to destroy him. Naomi, I said, looking at the contract. If we put his face on TV, if we make this a public spectacle, he will be marked forever. They agreed to your terms, Naomi said, pointing to a clause on page 4. They will use actors for the reenactments. They will blur faces. They will change names. They want to focus on the phenomenon of blame, not on a witch hunt against Ethan Doyle. They want your story, not your scandal. While I weighed the decision, Ethan was retreating further into his own delusion. His podcast episodes became darker, more paranoid. He stopped telling stories about his childhood poverty and started spinning conspiracy theories. There are forces working against me, he claimed in his latest episode, his voice sounding thin and brittle. A close relative is conspiring with the media to silence a truth-teller. They are threatened by my light. He did not dare speak my name. Marcus had sent him a cease and desist letter so terrifying that even Ethan's narcissism had to bow to it. I sat alone in my new condo. The walls were painted a soft sage green, a colour I picked simply because I liked it, not because it was on sale. I looked at the Horizon Lane contract on the table. Outside. The sun was setting over Harbourview. I picked up a pen. For 30 years. I had been a character in Ethan's story, the villain, the anchor, the failure. I realized that by signing this, I was not just telling my side. I was stepping out of his story entirely and starting my own. This was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. I uncapped the pen and signed my name. The production trucks from Horizon Lane Studios arrived in Harborview like a small invading army. They parked along the curb outside the Grand Harborview Hotel, the very same place where Ethan had publicly humiliated me years ago. They were there to film the climax of the documentary, centered around a fundraiser for the newly established Parental Support Fund. But fate, it seemed, had a twisted sense of humor. At the exact same time, the board of directors at Fairline Ridge Capital was scrambling to save their reputation. The rumors about Ethan's fraudulent online courses and the investigation into my stolen identity had spooked their investors. In a desperate bid for damage control, they proposed merging their annual corporate gala with our fundraiser. They wanted to brand it as an evening of reconciliation and social responsibility. They wanted to use the documentary cameras to show the world that Ethan was not a scammer, but a man in the process of healing. It was a trap, of course, but it was also a stage. 2 days before the event, Ethan came to my condo. He did not storm in this time. He knocked gently. He was wearing a soft blue sweater that made him look younger, less sharp. He carried a bouquet of lilies, my favorite flower, though he had not bought me flowers in 10 years. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with a sweetness that made my skin crawl. "Can we talk just us?" I let him in. He sat on the edge of my sofa, wringing his hands. "The board is breathing down my neck," he said, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "They want to fire me, Mom. But if this gala goes well, if we show a united front, I can save my career. I just need you to support me. One last time." I stood by the window, looking out at the parking lot. "What does support look like to you?" "Ethan?" He stood up and walked toward me, but he stopped just short of touching my arm. "Just, when you go on stage, tell them I am a good son. Tell them that we have had our differences, but I have always tried my best. If you say a few nice words, everyone will understand that you are on my side, and all this legal stuff will just go away." He truly believed it. He believed that my love was a bottomless well of forgiveness that he could draw from whenever he was thirsty. He thought I was still the woman who would sign a document without reading it just to make his life easier. I turned to face him. My face was a mask of calm. "I will be at the gala, Ethan, and I will speak." He exhaled, a long sound of relief, and smiled. It was the smile of a man who thought he had successfully manipulated the only person who had never told him no. "Thank you, Mom. I knew you wouldn't let me down." He left, whistling a tune as he walked to his car. He did not know that he had just invited his own reckoning. My lawyer, Marcus Reed, was less optimistic. We met in his office an hour later. He paced the room, his brow furrowed. "He is using you as a prop again. Margaret," Marcus warned, his voice low and dangerous. "He expects you to lie for him. If he feels cornered on that stage, he will attack. He will try to discredit you live on camera. Are you ready for that?" "I am not going there to lie, Marcus," I said, smoothing the fabric of my skirt. "I am going there to finish it." That night, I drove to the recording studio. I sat in the soundproof booth, the foam walls closing in around me. I turned on the microphone and recorded a special episode of No Longer the Scapegoat. I poured everything into it, the details of the fraud, the emotional blackmail, the years of silence. I saved the file and emailed it to Naomi and Tessa with a short subject line. If anything happens to me on that stage, release this. The next evening, I met with my support group in the basement of the library. The room was filled with familiar faces, parents who had been bankrupted, insulted, and abandoned. I told them what I planned to do. I told them I was terrified. "You are not just doing this for yourself," said David, the carpenter whose son was in prison. "You are doing it for every one of us who never got the chance to speak up." Now, I stand before the full-length mirror in my hotel room on the 4th floor of the Grand Harbourview. The gala is starting downstairs. I can hear the faint thrum of the bass from the ballroom. I am wearing a simple grey dress, elegant and fitted, purchased with my own money. I look at the woman in the reflection. Her hair is silver, her face is lined, but her shoulders are back. For decades. I looked in mirrors and searched for flaws to apologize for. Today, I see only strength. I am about to walk into a room full of cameras, investors, and the son who built his life on my imaginary failures. I am not walking down there to be his mother. I am walking down there to be the witness he never expected. The time for hiding is over. The ballroom lights were hot against my skin, but for the first time in 35 years, I did not feel like melting under them. The Horizon Lane camera crews moved silently through the crowd, capturing every bead of sweat on Ethan's forehead. He stood at the podium, gripping the wood so hard his knuckles were white. He was telling a modified version of his life, a story that had been sanitized for the shareholders, but still carried the poison he could not help but spit. "I made mistakes," Ethan said, his voice trembling with a practiced vulnerability. "I let my pain lead me down the wrong path. But you have to understand, I was raised in a home defined by fear. I was raised in scarcity." He turned toward me, extending a hand that felt more like a summons than an invitation. "But tonight, I want to honor the woman who did her best within her limitations. Please welcome my mother, Margaret." The applause was polite, thin and obligatory. I stood up. I could feel Ethan's eyes boring into me, willing me to be the silent, nodding prop I had always been. He expected me to walk up there, weep a little, and accept his backhanded compliment as if it were a crown. I walked up the stairs. My legs were steady. I took the microphone from his hand. He leaned in close, whispering through a clenched smile. "Stick to the script, Mom. Just say you're proud." I looked out at the audience. In the 3rd row, I saw Tessa, her pen poised over her notebook. Next to her was Marcus, his face unreadable, and beside him was Naomi. These were people who knew the truth. I looked back at the sea of strangers, investors, and Harbourview elites. "My son says I did my best within my limitations," I said, my voice clear and amplified by the speakers. The room went quiet. But the truth is, my only limitation was my silence. Ethan stiffened beside me. "My name is Margaret Doyle," I continued, looking directly into the center camera lens. "But some of you might know me better by my pen name. I am M. Doyle, the author of When Your Child Calls You the Culprit." A ripple went through the room. It started as a murmur and grew into a wave of shock. I saw heads turn. I saw phones light up as people frantically searched the name. A woman in the front row gasped audibly, covering her mouth. She knew. They were realizing that the voice they had been listening to on the No Longer the Scapegoat podcast was standing right in front of them. For 3 decades, I worked double shifts to fund the education of a man who stands here today and tells you I was afraid of work, I said, keeping my tone even. I was not afraid. I was tired. And while my son was selling you a story about overcoming a toxic mother for $499 a course, he was using my social security number to open fraudulent bank accounts without my consent. Stop. Ethan lunged for the microphone. She is confused. She doesn't know what she is saying. She is being manipulated by the media. But before he could touch me, a large security guard stepped out from the wings, placing a heavy hand on Ethan's chest. Marcus had done his job well. The organizers knew exactly what was coming. I am not confused, Ethan, I said, turning to face him. The room was deathly silent now. I am investigating. The authorities are currently reviewing the loans you took out in my name. I am not here to ruin you. You did that yourself. Ethan looked at me, his face crumbling. The mask of the successful victim was gone, replaced by the terrified look of a child who had finally pushed too far. Mom, he whispered, his voice cracking. Why? Because I love you, I said, and I meant it. But I will not pay for your sins anymore. From this moment on, you stand alone in your story. I placed the microphone back on the stand. It made a solid thud that echoed like a gavel. Marcus Reed stepped up to the podium as I walked away. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, his voice booming. Fairline Ridge and Mr. Doyle are cooperating fully with the ongoing investigation. A restitution fund has been established for the victims of the online course scheme. A significant portion of that fund is being seeded by the rights deal for Mrs. Doyle's upcoming documentary series. The irony hung in the air. I was saving him one last time, but this time, it was on my terms. As the realization hit the crowd, someone started clapping, then another. Suddenly, the room erupted. It was not the polite applause of the beginning. It was a roar. They stood up. They were cheering for the truth. I did not look back at Ethan. I walked down the stairs, past the flashing cameras, past the reporters shouting questions. I walked straight out the double doors into the empty hotel corridor. The heavy doors swung shut behind me, muffling the noise until it was just a dull hum. I leaned against the wall and took a deep breath, my lungs filled with cool, quiet air. The weight I had carried for 35 years, the guilt, the shame, the constant need to apologize for my own existence was gone. I was alone in the hallway. My hands were empty, and I had no idea what I would do tomorrow. But for the first time in my life, my heart was free. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Everyone, I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please drop your city or country in the comments below so we can see how far this family reaches. If this story touched you, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and smash the hype button to help more people hear this message. Stay strong, and remember, your story belongs to you.